Good afternoon and welcome to the OBR's press conference for our November 23 economic and fiscal forecast. I'm Steve Farrington, Chief of Staff at the OBR, and I will be chairing this event. I'm joined by the three members of the Budget Responsibility Committee, the Chair, Richard Hughes, along with Professor David Miles and Tom Josephs. In a moment, Richard will run us through a summary of the forecast that we have just published, after which the committee will take questions, both from those of us here in the room and those joining online. If you are joining us online, then you can submit questions at any time via Slido, which you can find via a link on our website. And with that, over to Richard.
Thanks, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll first take you through our latest forecast for the economy, and then turn to what it and the policies announced by the Chancellor in today's autumn statement imply for the public finances. As many have already noted, there have been significant changes to the economic and fiscal outlook since our last forecast back in March of this year. And these are driven by three key economic developments in the interim. First, the revisions to the historical GDP data and recent outturns suggest that the economy has proven more resilient to the twin shocks of the pandemic and the energy crisis than we believed back in March. As you can see from the gap between the yellow and blue lines on this chart, ONS revisions and outturn data since March suggest that output recovered more fully from the pandemic in 2021 and weathered the 2022 energy crisis better than we expected. And the level of output currently stands 2% above its pre-pandemic level, rather than remaining 1% below, as we thought in March. However, from this higher starting point, we now expect the economy to grow more slowly over the forecast period, at around 1.6% a year, which is around 1/4 percentage point less over the next 4 years than we forecast in March. This slower pace of output growth reflects a combination of more of the recovery from the economic shock of the pandemic now having happened in the past, higher interest rates weighing on household and corporate finances, and a revised assessment of the impact of demographic and technological changes on the effective supply of labor and capital in the economy. And as you can see from the right of this chart, the net result of these changes leaves the level of real output in the medium term only 0.5% higher than our March forecast. A second key development over the last 9 months is that inflation has turned out to be both more persistent and more domestically driven than we had anticipated. While inflation's more than halved from its 40-year peak of 11% at the end of last year, as you can see from this chart, it's still more than a percentage point higher in the third quarter of this year than we projected in March. And we now expect inflation to be higher over the remainder of the forecast, taking a further year to reach the Bank of England's 2% target and staying relatively close to that level in the years after that. We also expect the composition of inflation to be driven less by external and more by domestic factors. As you can see from the chart on the left, wholesale gas prices, which were the source of much of the increase in inflation in 2022, have fallen more quickly than we anticipated over the course of this year, and are expected to remain below our March forecast over the next 5 years. By contrast, as you can see from the chart on the right, the nominal earnings of UK workers have grown more quickly in recent months than we anticipated, and are forecast to be 4% higher by 2027-28 than in our March forecast. As you'll see later in this presentation, this more persistent and more domestically driven inflation has important implications for the underlying fiscal outlook. A third key economic development since the spring has been the further rise in UK and global interest rates. From the historic lows in the midst of the pandemic, as you can see from the chart on the left, markets now expect bank rates to peak at just over 5%, more than 1 percentage point higher than at the time of our March forecast. And as you can see from the chart on the right, yields on UK government debt are also over 1 percentage point higher across the curve, and have now also reached 5% at some long-dated maturities for the first time since 2002. For a government with a stock of debt approaching £3 trillion, this rise in the expected cost of servicing those liabilities also has significant fiscal implications. Turning to what these three changes in the economic outlook imply for the public finances relative to our March forecast. Higher and more domestically fueled inflation, and in particular the interplay between higher nominal earnings and frozen tax thresholds, raises nominal tax receipts and reduces underlying borrowing by around £60 billion in 2027-28. But higher inflation and earnings also push up the cost of inflation-linked welfare benefits and the triple lock state pension by around £20 billion. And higher inflation and interest rates also add £15 billion to the cost of servicing the government's debts. But because the Chancellor leaves departmental and other spending largely unchanged in cash terms despite higher inflation, These changes in the economic outlook deliver a £27 billion net fiscal windfall by the fifth year of our forecast. And the Chancellor chose to spend virtually all of that windfall on the policy measures he announced in his autumn statement today. So after accounting for the cost of these measures and their effect on the economy, this leaves total borrowing over the next 5 years almost completely unchanged relative to our March forecast. Looking in more detail at the autumn statement policy package, the Chancellor spends most of this £27 billion on two big tax cuts. First, a 2p cut in employee national insurance contributions and a 1p cut in the rate for the self-employed. These deliver a £343 average increase in take-home pay to 29 million workers at an average annual cost of £10 billion. We also expected to deliver a modest boost to work incentives, raising employment by 28,000 people. But as it also raises hours worked by those already in employment, delivering a total increase in hours worked across the economy of 94,000 in full-time equivalent terms. Second, the Chancellor's autumn statement makes upfront write-offs for business investment permanent, rather than allow them to expire in March of 2026. This costs around £9 billion a year and boosts total investment by £14 billion over our 5-year forecast period, and even more beyond that. He also announces a further package of welfare reforms aimed at boosting the labour supply, this time targeting those on health-related benefits. And we estimate that they will help get around 50,000 more people into employment over the next 5 years. The two big tax cuts to personal and corporate taxes in this autumn statement reduce the overall tax burden by around 0.5% of GDP. But the tax burden still rises in every year of the forecast to a post-war high of almost 38% of GDP. This 4.5 percentage point forecast rise in the post-pandemic tax burden is due to a combination of increases in tax rates, like the rise in the headline rate of corporation tax from 19% to 25%, and higher forecast inflation and frozen personal tax thresholds, dragging more people into higher tax bands. Indeed, freezing virtually all allowances and thresholds in the personal tax system between 2022 and 2028 raises an estimated £45 billion in additional revenue compared to indexing them to inflation, and creates nearly 4 million more basic, 3 million more higher rate, and 400,000 more additional rate taxpayers over the next 5 years. And it's worth dwelling for a moment on something the Chancellor didn't announce in his autumn statement, which is any major change to departmental spending plans, despite significantly higher inflation. Departmental expenditure limits, or DELs, account for around 40% of public spending and are allocated out between departments in periodic spending reviews. The current spending review period comes to an end in 2024-25, and the next review is not scheduled until after the next general election. As you can see from the chart on the left, this means that 4 out of the 5 years in our forecast for this large proportion of public spending are not based on any detailed departmental plans from the government. Indeed, the Treasury simply provides us with an assumed level of total current and capital spending for the period beyond March of 2025. Their decision in this autumn statement to add just £5 billion a year in cash terms to departmental budgets, despite significantly higher inflation, means that the real spending power of these budgets is eroded by around £19 billion relative to our March forecast, as you can see from the chart on the right. The eagle-eyed amongst you will recognise that's roughly equal to the amount the Chancellor spent on the two big tax cuts in this fiscal event. Had he sought to preserve the real spending power of public services in the face of higher inflation over the next 5 years, that would have left him relatively little to spend on other measures in this fiscal event. The Chancellor's decision to spend virtually all of the fiscal improvement in this forecast means that the overall path of borrowing as a share of GDP is largely unchanged relative to our March forecast. From a post-war high of 15% of GDP during the pandemic, borrowing falls to 4.5% of GDP this year, and then steadily over the next 5 years to around 1% of GDP in 2028-29. Were this path to be delivered, it would mean borrowing falls to its lowest level as a share of GDP since the start of the century. An unchanged path of borrowing means the Chancellor remains on track to meet his fiscal target of getting debt to fall as a share of GDP in 5 years' time. Underlying debt peaks at 93.2% of GDP in 2026-27, and then falls in the last 2 years of the forecast to 92.8% of GDP. He even has slightly more headroom against his debt falling target at £13 billion, compared to the £6.5 billion of headroom he had back in March. But all of this improvement comes from the rolling nature of the rule, giving him a further year to meet it, rather than from any substantive improvement in the fiscal position. Had the target continued to apply in 2027-28, rather than 28-29, he would have just scraped by with just £1.6 billion of headroom. But even £13 billion remains a modest amount compared to the margins set aside by previous chancellors against their fiscal rules, which averaged just under £30 billion since 2010. And it's important to bear in mind that few of these rules were ever actually met. And one needs to judge the adequacy of that modest amount of fiscal headroom against the array of potential risks to the fiscal outlook. On the economy side, it would only take interest rates to be another half a percentage point higher, annual GDP growth to be 0.1 percentage points lower, or health-related inactivity to continue rising in line with recent trends to wipe out this headroom entirely. On the fiscal side, key risks come from an array of stated government policies whose implementation is subject to question. The most doubtful of these is the stated intention of delivering an RPI plus 5p indexation of fuel duty next year and RPI indexation after that. Freezing fuel duty at its current rate instead, as every government has done since 2011, would knock £6 billion off the Chancellor's headroom. Sticking to the government's stated departmental spending plans has also become more difficult in the face of more persistent inflation and new long-term commitments, such as the NHS workforce plan. Just preserving the real spending power that departments had in March would require an additional £19 billion by 2027-28. And this is just a third of the £30 billion that chancellors have added to spending totals in the run-up to the last two spending reviews. Finally, our fiscal forecasts assume that all of the main personal tax allowances and thresholds remain frozen for the next 5 years, and the tax burden continues to rise to a post-war high. Were the tax take to be held at its current level, this would cost an additional £45 billion in 2028-29. In summary, the economy has proven to be more resilient to the shocks of the pandemic and the energy crisis, but we now expect it to grow more slowly over the next 5 years. We also expect inflation to be more persistent and domestically fueled, which means that interest rates are expected to remain higher to bring price rises under control. Higher inflation has pushed up tax receipts, but also welfare benefits, while higher interest rates have pushed up the cost of servicing the government's debts. But thanks to his decision to leave departmental spending plans largely unchanged in cash terms, our latest forecast gives the Chancellor a net fiscal windfall of £27 billion in 5 years' time. He spends virtually all of this on two big personal and business tax cuts and a smaller package of welfare reforms, which provide a modest boost to the supply potential of the economy. But thanks to the deadline for his debt target rolling onto another year, he actually increases his headroom against that target from £6.5 to £13 billion. And with that, I'll hand back to Steve to manage the questions.
Great. Thank you, Richard. OK, we have plenty of time for questions, and there are a fair few already coming in via Slido, but let me check if there are any in the room first. Yes, just here. Could I ask you, wait for the mic, and could you introduce yourself before you ask the question, please?
Jack Bonnet from The Times. You've obviously focused quite a lot on there on public spending not being increased in line with inflation. I mean, that's just, that's obviously just not going to happen, is it? Surely these forecasts will be taken with a pinch of salt, and the Chancellor will be under pressure to raise public spending.
I think when we put together our forecast for non-welfare, non-interest spending, the spending that is allocated out to departments and spending reviews, we're given an assumption by the Treasury to use in our forecast. We always highlight the risks around that forecast, and it stands to reason that given that inflationary pressures have gone up, also the government has made more long-term commitments since our March forecast, in particular the NHS workforce plan. The pressures on that spending assumption are growing, and it has not changed to reflect in full the price pressures that have emerged since our last forecast, or the policy pressures in terms of things like the NHS workforce plan, other commitments like trying to get the ODA GNI target back up when fiscal circumstances allow, and other ambitions like the Prime Minister's ambition to raise the defence spending above the current 2% target are further pressures on that. Because the Chancellor hasn't done a spending review and allocated out departmental spending plans, it's hard for us to scrutinise those plans in any kind of detail. But they do imply public spending falling as a share of GDP over the next 5 years, and that's part of what delivers that headroom against his target.
Okay, thanks. Yes. Mike, please.
Philip Inman from The Guardian. David, this is probably one for you. the Chancellor doesn't seem to be getting as big a bang for his buck as he would like. All his initiatives don't seem to be repaid in higher growth, either in the short or long term. What do you think?
Well, to increase the sort of underlying supply potential of the UK economy is a big task. You're trying to move a huge thing and push hard and move it a little bit, and it takes quite a long time for stuff to come through. I mean, the big measures today, the one on capital allowances and the national insurance measure, once they've fed through by the end of the forecast, and they haven't fully fed through by the end of the forecast, they add, a fraction of 1%. Now, you could look at that and say, well, that doesn't sound very much. But moving supply potential through, for example, changing the capital stock takes quite a long while, because the flow of you can move the flow of investment by a meaningful amount, but it's the capital stock. And part of the impact of the full expensing measure actually comes through even beyond the end of the forecast horizon, because it makes investment, the incentive to invest is higher permanently, and you get some of the impact of that over 5 years, which increases the capital stock, but you get a bit more sort of off stage beyond the horizon that we're really focusing on. But I think my main point is that it's actually very difficult for governments to, in a relatively short period, like a few years, to make a sort of big meaningful effect on growth. The reason why the growth outlook in the near term is a little bit worse, though, is to some extent anyway, it's a reflection of what in many ways is a bit of good news, which is that the starting level of GDP has just got revised up very, very substantially by the ONS. So the starting level of GDP, like this year now, is 3% higher than we thought in March. And the ONS just thinks that the level of economic activity is a lot higher. You might say, well, what's not to like about that? But what it means is that, along with other measures of slack in the economy, it now looks like, rather than what we thought back in March, which was that there'd be some spare capacity in the economy, and therefore you'd grow to get rid of that, we actually probably start from a position with a little bit of excess demand relative to the supply potential of the economy. So that's what accounts for quite a big chunk of the somewhat slower growth in GDP over the next few years. You're not using up spare capacity. You're actually starting from a level of economic activity significantly higher than we thought. So there isn't any slack to use up.
Thank you. Yes.
Paul Wallace, I'm a freelance journalist. Presumably one way of squaring the circle is if you can get higher productivity in government departments. And I just wondered how realistic you might feel that is, given past experience.
Yeah, thanks. So the government has, at this event, set out some initial plans for looking to drive increases in public sector productivity in the future. I mean, because, as Richard said, the government's not actually set out spending plans beyond next year at this event. We are not able, therefore, to analyse those spending plans, and we're not either able to analyse the impact that the government's sort of plans for public sector productivity might have. I mean, clearly it is the case, given the pressures on public spending that Richard outlined, that trying to drive improvements in public sector productivity will be really important if the government wants to try and hit all of the targets that it set out within the current envelope. But at the current time, they've not provided sort of detail on those plans that would allow us to really assess them.
And I mean, sorry.
But the wider context of attempts to, sorry, it's just that no matter what the plans might be, what about the context of previous attempts to try to produce higher productivity in the public sector, which haven't been very impressive?
So it's true they have a mixed track record. And And in particular, post-pandemic, it does look as though the productivity of key public services is below where it was pre-pandemic, for reasons which both the ONS and others, indeed in this building, have been looking into. I suppose one thing to underscore from our perspective, which is people who are trying to forecast the fiscal bottom line, which is the difference between tax revenue and spending, is that it's only productivity gains that allow you to actually reduce cost that reduce the bottom line. So it's productivity gains that allow you to reduce spending that are meaningful in fiscal terms. Obviously, productivity gains that deliver better public services to people are great. And there are lots of people in this room who focus a lot on how do you improve the sort of output per person and the quality of the services provided. But from the point of view of actually trying to deliver some benefit to the fiscal bottom line and borrow less, it's only the productivity gains which are cashable, which means you can reduce the number of employees, reduce the amount of spending you are doing per unit that actually make a difference to things like borrowing and debt. And that means that in cases, in services where you're delivering productivity improvements, you have to find a way of taking cost out, either by reducing the number of employees or reducing other costs of providing those services.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Any more questions in the room at this point? Okay, so let me turn to a few from online. We have quite a few to get through. So let me start by taking a couple that are related to the risks around public finances. So the UK's national debt as a share of GDP is very close to 100% still. How easily could the public finances absorb another shock such as COVID or the financial crisis? And let me group that also with another question which is similar, which is, in an increasingly deglobalizing world, will the UK become more and more exposed to external shocks, such as wholesale food shocks? Richard, do you want to take those together?
Yeah, so in terms of what would be the implications of another major shock given the UK's debt burden? I think, and it crucially depends on how interest rates react to those shocks. One of the reasons why advanced economies, and indeed all economies with rising debt burdens, have been able to accommodate recent shocks has been that when shocks hit everybody, interest rates on government debt tend to fall. And that gives them some breathing space to borrow to get through those shocks. What would be more worrying is either a shock that doesn't drive interest rates down but drives them up. I think one of the reasons why the energy crisis has been such a challenge to manage through fiscally has been the fact that energy prices were rising while governments were trying to provide support to their populations while interest rates were also rising. And so that presents a more challenging context in which governments have to respond to those kind of pressures. And so much government's room for manoeuvre depends very much on what happens to interest rates going forward. Markets expect them to stay relatively high at the moment, and certainly well above the level that they were in after the financial crisis and during the pandemic. And that does limit government's room for manoeuvre to react to shocks. But it does depend on how those interest rates themselves respond to the shocks. If there's once again a flight to safety and a rush to government debt, that can bring down government borrowing costs temporarily and allow them to borrow temporarily to get through it. The challenge at the moment is governments have racked up a lot of debt managing the last set of crises, and interest rates on that debt have now risen quite a lot.
Thanks. David, did you want to add something on this?
I did. I think one of the most interesting charts in the report we've just put out is on the last page. So you have to get right to the end of it to see it. It's on page 145, and it shows the impacts over the next 4 or 5 years of different kinds of shocks that could hit the economy, some bad, some good. I'm just going to say something briefly on one of them, which is productivity. So the central forecast we have is really a continuation of, by historical standards, quite low growth in productivity in the UK, so-called total factor productivity rising by a little bit under 1%. If instead we had a partial return to the kind of productivity growth rates we saw for much of the post-war period, certainly until the financial crisis, of productivity growing by 1.5% instead of a bit under 1%, by the end of the forecast horizon, the stock of debt would be about £200 billion lower. If, on the other hand, total factor productivity didn't grow by any more than the abysmal rate that it's grown over the last 10 years, so it grew by 0.5% rather than the close to 1%, 5 years down the road, the stock of debt would be £200 billion higher. So there's a £400 billion swing. What is that? 9 no, 11, 12, 13% of GDP. Swing in the stock of debt just over the next 4 or 5 years for what is within the boundaries of reasonable probability for productivity growth over that period. So you can get very big swings in the stock of debt, even over a relatively short period like 4 or 5 years, from what you might call a good shock or a bad shock, but they're not even extreme shocks. And that's just the nature of an economy where the government plays a really big role and the stock of debt is already pretty high.
Thanks, David. Let me take a question it's in 2 parts. The first part is probably for Tom initially and then maybe David. Is fiscal drag more powerful than a national insurance cut? As in, will workers be paying more tax by 2028, 29, not less? And then secondly, why do you believe that workers will work fewer hours? One of the main drivers of your downgrade to potential growth. So, Tom, do you want to start on fiscal drag and then David on hours?
Yeah, thanks very much. So it is the case that in this forecast, a significant driver of the higher receipts and stronger receipts growth that we have in the forecast compared to March is due to the combination of stronger nominal earnings in the forecast, basically driven by the view that inflation will be higher and more persistent and more domestically driven than we assumed previously. So that stronger nominal earnings combining with the frozen tax thresholds, meaning that fiscal drag is a powerful driver of increased tax receipts and is stronger than we were previously forecasting. So we estimate that this effect basically drives around £44 billion worth of receipts by the end of the forecast, which is about 15 billion higher than we were forecasting in March. The next cuts that the Chancellor has announced in this statement reduce the tax take by around 10 billion by the end of the forecast. So roughly they are offsetting about a quarter of the increases in personal taxes that result from fiscal drag.
Okay. David.
Yeah, in terms of labour supply in the economy, we downgraded a bit labour supply because of an hours effect due to the ageing of the workforce. So it's not that workers of a given age work fewer hours than we thought back in March. It is that we've reassessed the pace of ageing of the workforce and the link between older workers and hours work, which on average is a negative one when you get past a certain age. So that's a kind of negative in the forecast about the labour supply. It's offset to a meaningful extent by the positive effects on labour supply of the national insurance cut. And that both shows up as some people being drawn into the labour force because the tax on income is a bit lower, but also those already in the labour force, which is obviously a much bigger number, working some more hours. And the more hours work from the national insurance contribution rate cut is not a trivial number. I think it's the equivalent of having about 80,000 more people working full-time. In other words, you take how many more hours are worked by the people already with a job because they pay a bit less tax, and that's the equivalent, the extra hours work is the equivalent of having 80,000 more full-time people working. So you've got sort of two effects going on there in the labour supply.
Thanks, David. Let me just see if there are any more questions in the room at this point. And you are allowed to ask more than one question as reward for coming to our press conference in person. So just put your hand up if you have further questions. But let me continue with the questions online. So then I think one probably for Richard, maybe in the first instance. The level of GDP is higher, but growth is lower. The fiscal position is better, but the Chancellor has spent it. Where does this leave fiscal sustainability?
So I would say broadly unchanged compared to where we were back in March, because in essence, higher inflation has given him some extra tax receipts in the form of fiscal drag, and he's given it back to people in the form of a rate cut. And so in that sense, the level of debt as a share of GDP is slightly lower, but that is largely because the starting level of GDP is higher. So that is thanks to historical revisions to the level of GDP by the ONS. So that's what brings the level of debt down a little bit as a ratio of GDP. In borrowing terms, borrowing is virtually unchanged in every year of the forecast. He has spent all of the fiscal windfall that he got essentially from higher inflation.
Great, thank you. Let me then group together a couple of questions about capital allowances. So I might come to you first, David, if it's okay. So those are, do you think the capital allowances measure is good value for money? It increases 3 billion a year to investment, but costs 11 billion. Is that a significant change? And similarly, how much of the policy is deadweight investment that would have incurred anyway?
The costs of the measure are a bit front-end loaded. So if you have 100% first-year allowances, as opposed to allowances that mean that you can get tax deductions into the future when you do some investment, at the point at which you bring that in, it costs quite a lot of money. So it costs like 10 billion, 11 billion, whatever the number is, for most of the next few years. In the long run, actually, the cost falls off quite a lot because people have got the tax breaks on investment up front, and then they don't get any more in the future. And so what happens to the fiscal costs is it starts out relatively high, but then several years down the road, where under the old system, you were still getting tax reliefs, you're getting no tax relief on investment that you do over sometime in the next few years. So that number, 10, 11 billion of cost right now, will drop off very substantially. Again, it happens off stage because it happens beyond the end of the forecast horizon. And I think it drops down to a small fraction of the 10 billion, maybe even as low as 2 billion or so. So the boost to investment certainly overtakes the fiscal cost, not over the forecast horizon, but beyond that. What was the other part of the question? So, or maybe that was the
how much of it might be deadweight?
Oh, right. Well, the deadweight element, in other words, the investment that would have happened anyway, that you now get the upfront allowance rather than it being fed to you slowly over time, in a sense is just an outright cut in tax on corporate activity. In itself, of course, that's just handing more money back to companies. That's not the incentivization to new investment bit. The I can't even say it. Incentivization to new investment is the thing that we calibrate in the report, and that comes to about 15 billion over the next few years. But it's kind of permanent because you permanently get this extra incentive to invest.
Okay, thanks, David. I do see a hand up.
Richard, you've characterised the Chancellor as spending inflation windfall in the first year. How responsible on a scale of 1 to 10 do you think that is? And do you think with public investment also held steady as well as departmental spending, do you think that that is also going to detract from our ability to increase the supply side of the economy and improve infrastructure?
I think rather than use your scale of budget responsibility, so the Chancellor has his own scale of budget responsibility, which is his objective to get debt falling as a share of GDP. Now, the headroom against that target has gone from 6.5 billion to 13 billion in this forecast, but that is entirely because the deadline for the target has moved forward a year, rather than any improvement in the underlying health of the public finances. In the year in which it was falling due, in our last forecast, that number's now down to less than 2. So in that sense, I would say that the health of public finances are broadly unchanged relative to March. He's now got himself an extra year to get to his destination, and he's taken some advantage of that in the decisions that he's made today. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Capital.
On capital spending? Yes. So on both the current and capital spending side, there's not a big change in the government's plans. But I mean, the biggest challenge for us as forecasters is there's no detail to these plans. They're literally just numbers. They're four numbers that we have to, we're given to look at over our forecast period. There are not detailed spending plans either on the capital side or on the current spending side to understand the implications of those and the realism of those. And that is the nature of the system which we have, which is until you do a spending review, these are just penciled in totals. So it's difficult to judge the deliverability of those without knowing what the government's plan for delivering them is. It's certainly the case in this country that we haven't had any problems cutting capital spending. When we've needed to support the fiscal position. It has its costs in the longer run. When governments reduce capital spending, it has implications for the capital stock and growth in our forecast. And at the moment, that is what's assumed in the government spending plans. Capital spending is held constant in cash terms, but falling in real terms and falling as a share of GDP.
So the Chancellor has chosen to support private investment and kept public investment flat. Do you have, without knowing what any of that's going to be spent on, but do you have a general rule of thumb as to which will give you more bang for your buck in terms of boosting growth? I don't know whether David has a comment on that as well.
I mean, in terms of the way in which we look at the drivers of growth, one of them is the capital stock. And we assume that there is both a private component and a public component. I think we don't say that either one of those is more growth supporting than the other. But if you promote private sector growth at the expense of public sector growth, then in net terms you may not be better off.
David, okay, let me turn to a couple of questions then around our welfare and labour supply forecast. So I might come to Tom on these in the first instance to take them together. So how have changes in the outturn and judgments for the forecast of ill health and disability since March changed spending plans or the labour force in your forecast? And more generally, how worried should we be about the economy with rising ill health and disability?
Okay, thanks. So we have seen quite a sharp increase in overall welfare spending in this forecast compared to March. And that is largely driven actually by higher inflation, with most benefits uprated by CPI. And we also have slightly higher unemployment in this forecast, which is also driving up the welfare forecast compared to previously. We also have welfare as a share of GDP rises over the forecast horizon. So I think it's the only element of spending that is rising as a share of GDP over our forecast. And a large part of that is driven by CPI uprating, but also by an increase in caseloads of people who are on health-related benefits. So we have seen a rising trend in this for some time. It began before COVID, obviously accelerated through COVID, and has continued since. We have actually in this forecast slightly revised down our expectation of the growth of that caseload in the medium term, on the basis that we think some of the strength after COVID may have been due to cost of living pressures which sort of recede over the forecast horizon. But even after making that adjustment, there is a significant increase in caseloads related to health and disability. The government has set out a number of measures at this event which are focused on this issue. So a number of measures which are aiming to provide or more or expand the available support for people to return to work. And we have estimated that those measures at this event will increase employment by around 50,000 people by the end of the forecast. But even after that, the caseloads are rising significantly.
Great, thanks, Tom. A few questions on our inflation forecast, which I'll group together and pass to David in the first instance. So your forecast has changed dramatically. What has driven that? And some more specific questions are, what are the upward contributions from the spending and tax cuts, and announced today, and in particular the impact of the NIC reduction?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the forecast really this time around is that inflation just drops more slowly back to the Bank of England's inflation target than we had thought back in March. I mean, that's partly on the back of inflation having until very recently been a bit higher than we forecast back in March. It's also related to the combination of direct measures of capacity utilisation looking a bit stronger, perhaps not surprising in light of the ONS reappraisal. GDP in the UK is 3% higher than we thought back in March. So that means the labour market is a little bit tighter than we'd thought, and the nominal wages, which have already been a bit stronger, the rate of increase in nominal wages has been a bit stronger than we thought back in March. We think that carries forward over the forecast horizon. So inflation just takes a little bit longer to get back to the Bank of England's target. It's not on our central forecast anyway until early in 2025 as opposed to middle of kind of 2024. It's almost a year later that inflation gets back to the target. So what was the second half? The second part?
The contributions from measures to inflation forecast.
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, one thing that doesn't change very much in this forecast is total borrowing, and that in a sense is a measure of the extent to which the government is adding to demand within the economy. So had borrowing been substantially higher or lower than we thought back in March, that would have changed the assessment of how the government is affecting demand within the economy. But that is a non-event, frankly, in this autumn statement, because actually borrowing is very little different in any year of the forecast. So our reassessment of inflation pressures, which is really about the speed with which inflation drops back to the Bank of England's target and actually goes a little bit beneath it in our forecast, that's really all about somewhat higher nominal wage settlements, not high enough to prevent real wages falling until very recently, and a bit of a tighter squeeze on capacity utilisation in the UK. It's more about that than it is about any change in what you might call the induced demand effects from fiscal policy changes, which actually wash out to be virtually zero.
Great. Thanks, David. I don't see any more questions in the room, so let me continue with Slido. So question for, I think probably Richard in the first instance. So would it have been more prudent for the Chancellor to utilise the additional funds for reducing government debt?
I think it's not for us to tell the Chancellor what to do with the public finances. I mean, comparing his reaction to this windfall to previous Chancellors, the IFS did a very nice paper on this question in their Green Budget looking back. And I think they found that typically Chancellors spend around 60% of windfalls and only adjust, so positive windfalls, and only adjust to less than half of negative windfalls. So I guess this Chancellor spent all of this one. So I guess by the track record of what's known as fiscal reaction functions of previous Chancellors, he spent a bit more of this windfall than in the past. But he has still met the targets set for himself according to our forecast.
Question for, I think, probably David. How helpful has the reduction in gilt yields been over the past month in limiting the increase in debt interest spending?
It's helpful. Both the recent slight reduction in gilt yields, I mean, assuming it's sustained anyway, that's helpful, as is the somewhat lower market expectations of bank rate relative to the date on which we sort of fixed them for our central forecast. And I think since then, bank rate expectations on average over the next few years are down by something like 1/3 of 1%, which is meaningful. And gilt yields are probably down by a little bit less than that, maybe 1/4 of 1%. So if that's where they stay, and that is what happens to bank rate, that it's about 1/3 of a percentage point less than we had assumed when we made the assumption for where bank rate was going. That's probably worth, given how many reserves the Bank of England holds as backing against the gilts that they hold, that effectively reduces the interest rate on a stock of government debt. And that's probably worth, over the forecast horizon, something probably approaching £2 billion a year, not trivial. And you get an extra boost if the yield curve stayed where it is at the moment, which is about 0.25% lower than we had assumed. And that takes longer to actually feed through, but that's probably worth another billion or so. So by the end of the forecast horizon, you could see the interest rate bill being £3-4 billion lower than in our central forecast. Of course, the yield curve moves up and down by 10, 15 basis points, in a quiet week. So who knows how long that's going to last. And expectations of bank rate are, super sensitive to the next inflation number, and we'll have, 2 or 3 of those just within the period between now and the new year.
Thanks, David. A couple of questions already looking ahead to our March forecast. Well, there we go. So they are, Richard, maybe I'll come to you for this. Given the assumptions in this forecast, what do they imply for the Chancellor's capacity to reduce tax in March, and what headroom might the Chancellor have to cut taxes in his March forecast?
We only just finished this one, and there are lots of very tired eyes around this room, so I think I'm certainly not going to start speculating about how things might look in March. I think David highlighted very nicely what are the key sources of risk to our outlook, which are the things that could change between now and March. One is the inflation picture, and we've seen in successive forecasts of ours sort of bad inflation for the public finances, which is imported inflation from higher energy prices that raise prices but don't raise incomes and don't raise tax receipts. And then, over the course of the last year, we've seen more of the kind of fiscally favorable inflation, and especially when you have frozen tax thresholds, when that raises wages and other tax bases in the economy, that delivers a fiscal benefit to the Chancellor. And so depending on the composition of inflation between now and March, that's one key source of risk and uncertainty. As I mentioned before, how interest rates react, and David just highlighted just how sensitive the public finances are nowadays to interest rate changes, is another key moving part between now and March, which we will keep an eye on, and I'm sure the Chancellor will as well. But most important is where we think things are going on the underlying productivity of the economy, which took a big shock and hit during the financial crisis. Another one during the pandemic has been also affected by the energy crisis, and one of the most important judgments we make in any forecast is this question around what we think is the underlying trend rate of productivity growth of the UK economy, and that's something which we also keep under review between forecasts.
Tom, did you want to add something on this?
I would just add, in terms of risks, we have seen so far this year a big increase in tax receipts compared to our March forecast, and a lot of that we think has been driven by this higher and more persistent and more domestically driven inflation than we were expecting compared to March. We are assuming essentially that much of that strength in receipts continues for the rest of the year. But there is always a huge amount of uncertainty even around that kind of short-term outlook for receipts, and that is another risk facing the forecast as we come to March.
Great, thanks, Tom. Okay, Tom, I might come straight back to you with a question on a different topic, which is the triple lock. Is it the case that the state pension triple lock is assumed to continue throughout the forecast period? And if so, can the OBR put the cost of this policy into context?
So yes, it is assumed to be maintained essentially through the forecast period, and I think that to just give you an idea of the scale of the cost, that roughly compared to just operating pensions in line with CPI, the cost would have been about 2 billion this year alone. So that's the sort of scale of cost involved.
Thanks, Tom. Yes.
You have box 5.1, and it's about R minus G and the impact. I wonder whether you could just talk us through that. And in particular, you had an analysis of that in your fiscal risks report in September, and has the situation got worse since then? Because you do a comparison with March, where I think you say it has been, but I can't. Anyway, perhaps you could enlighten me on that.
I think you've got three people who are enthusiastic and you want to talk about box 5.1, but David, do you want to have a first go? It's the one about R minus G.
Yes. Well, I think R minus G has got a bit worse. Probably the cleanest measure. Well, what is R? I mean, R. You can think of R as the real interest rate on the outstanding stock of debt for the government, and the cleanest measure of that would be, in real terms, would be the yield on index-linked debt. And the yield on index-linked debt, I mean, it's gone up enormously over the last few years. If you go back 3 years to November 2020, for 10-year index-linked debt, the UK government was able to sell debt offering a guaranteed real interest rate of -3%. Now it's about +1%. And the growth rate, at least over the relatively short horizon that the EFO focuses most on, the next 5 years, is a little bit lower. So the R minus G gap, certainly relative to a couple of years ago, is much less favourable. It's a bit less favourable relative to March because interest rates are up, index-linked and conventionals, probably 0.5%, maybe a little bit more. No, even more than that, actually, in the period since then. So the R minus G metric of how much pressure the government's under has got meaningfully worse, certainly over the last 2 or 3 years, but even in the last 6 months or so. Now, having said all that, the question we had just a moment ago was, what's happened in the last month or so? And the average interest rate on gilts, both index-linked and conventional, is down about 25 basis points. So it can move a lot in a short period of time. And the R minus G calculations got worse for pretty much every rich country. It's probably got most worse in the US, but it's not got better in the UK.
And that international comparison is one of the many rewards of getting to the end of the EFO is this box, but and the international comparison is also interesting because, as David said, everybody's interest rates have gone up, but ours have gone up a lot more. And we seem to have a worrying configuration of American-style interest rates, but European-style growth. And so the dynamics are looking particularly unpleasant for us as a G7 member because we've got relatively high interest rates, but we haven't got the American GDP growth to go along with it.
Thank you. Okay, so we've covered quite a lot of ground, so I think I'll make this the last question unless there are any final takers in the room after this. And I think it's one for David. Why are your forecasts for GDP so much stronger than the Bank of England's November forecast?
Because we're genetically more optimistic than the central bank. No, that's not really true. We take a slightly more positive view on underlying growth and potential of the economy. So the thing that's actually really difficult to forecast because there aren't good economic models of it is productivity. So total factor productivity, which in some ways is the actual key determinant of where the economy is going and fiscal pressures over a longish horizon, is something that's very difficult to forecast. Nobody expected TFP growth in the UK after the global financial crisis would stay permanently at a dismally low rate. Our assessment is, just for a central forecast, there's loads of uncertainty about this, that we get back to something sort of halfway between the dismal almost 15 years since the global financial crisis and the 30 years previous to that. 30 years previous to that, TFP growth, sort of 2% a year. Last 15 years, it's barely positive. So we get back to about 1% on total factor productivity. I think the bank takes, you could call it a more cautious view, you could call it a more pessimistic view, a more conservative view, that there isn't much of a recovery from recent rates. So that's one quite significant factor. Obviously, the bank's last forecast, of course, didn't have the measures that we now know are going to play out over the next 5 years. That's a positive on the supply potential of the UK economy. So we have that in there as well. So those are the two things I would probably focus on. I think I'm right in saying, but I'm not quite so confident about this. I think that when we took our judgment on the path of bank rate itself, it may have been a little bit south of where the bank set their projection, and that may have had a marginal impact as well. So I think those are some of the factors.
Okay, thanks, David. Right, in which case, let me draw things to a close there. Just to add, by way of wrapping up, that as both David and Richard have said, as we went through our answers, you will be rewarded by making it all the way through our EFO document. There's plenty in there for you. And it's the product of a lot of hours work by the hard-working staff of the OBR. So let me also thank them on behalf of the committee. And thanks to you for coming along today and for joining us online. And we look forward to you joining us again for our next forecast in March. Thank you.